So, good afternoon, everyone. I think we should probably go ahead and start because the program is so packed and there's so much to do, and I think we've got a really exciting session in front of us. So I'm Doug Gollin, and it's an honor for me to chair this panel on the emerging agenda for macro development. I should clarify at the beginning that anybody who's thinking that macro in this context implies anything about stabilization or monetary policy may be a little bit disappointed. But the macro development that I'm talking about is a new literature, I think, that is focusing on growth, on the use of microdata for macro questions or questions at the aggregate level. But I think we'll find out a little more over the next hour about what exactly is going on here. I'm really excited to have a panel with three fantastic people who come to this question from different angles. In the spirit of economists at conferences, I'm not going to do much in the way of introductions. If you want to find out more about the people who are here, you can look them up. But I'm really delighted to have Eliana Ferrara from Kennedy School at Harvard, Rachel Ngai from Imperial College and LSE, and Paula Bustos from CEPR in Madrid, bringing perspectives from the microdevelopment literature, the macro growth literature, and broadly speaking, the trade literature, and maybe trying to find the common ground and to bring together some of what we've been learning about development and some of the ways that we're bringing new methods and new questions to the data. So I thought I'd structure this by asking each of the panelists a couple of questions, do a round or two of questions, and then maybe open things up for a conversation that would be a little bit broader. And so please keep in mind, we'd love to hear from you. And so I'll just try to manage time so that there's, I hope, plenty of time for discussion as we go forward. So I thought maybe as a starting point, I'd begin by putting Eliana on the spot a little bit here. As somebody who's the head of the CEPR development program and who brings, if we're talking about macro development, brings that to the table. And I guess my first question would be something like this. Over the past 20 years or so, development economics has really made massive advances in our understanding of what works and what doesn't through the use of experimental and quasi-experimental methods. And that, I think, has, for those of us who are old enough to remember development economics from before that, that's really transformed in many ways the quality of evidence that we use and what we look for. And I think, kind of looking back, that literature began with a lot of quite small-scale, narrowly focused studies of what were almost evaluations at the project level of what worked and what was having an effect. And that literature kind of then moved to thinking about deeper questions around behavioral constraints and so on. I have the sense that in recent years, the experimental literature has been looking for ways to think about impacts at scale, and to think about general equilibrium effects that go beyond the kind of more narrowly defined project level. And I guess I'd just ask you, how do you see the evolution of the experimental literature? Where do you think things have been going? Where do you see the development literature trying to move as it tackles some of these issues of scale and GE?
Thank you, Doug. Yeah. This is actually a great question, I think, and it brings me back to before experiments, if I may, because I want to put this trend into a longer-term assessment of where we started from. And in the 70s and 80s, development was pretty much a macro field. And, it was all about stabilization, structural reforms, and then what happened was that in the 90s, with the applied micro-literature making progress on issues related to market imperfections, many models were used to understand the constraints to development and growth in low-income countries. And then, that was more like, okay, let's use theory and let's have descriptive evidence in terms of microdata that was becoming available. And when I did grad school, I think there were basically 5 data sources that had household level information in all of sub-Saharan Africa. So there wasn't very much that you could do except, get some correlations that were matching or not matching the predictions of your model. And then we are all more familiar with the revolution that came with randomized controlled trials. And as Doug said, at first the emphasis on causality and on getting identification was so strong that the question seemed to be, what works? Can we show that something led to an effect? And then, of course, that only brings you so far. So the more recent evolution of that school is more, why does it work? And experiments are designed to be able to test mechanisms. So that's where we go back to theory and to the microeconomic underpinnings of whatever a certain intervention is supposed to do, and design more complex experiments. But even within these upgraded class of trials, there remains some skepticism in the profession on a couple of fronts. One is generalizability. There's work, very interesting work, for example, the recent paper by Eva Vival, that has taken estimates from many well-executed trials and shown a very large degree of dispersion. So if we want to learn from these trials and then use them to predict effects in a certain context, we may hope to get the right sign, but we have very little hope to get the right magnitude. And this idea of being unable to generalize simply by taking different studies that have been conducted in an uncoordinated way has led some to try and implement multi-site trials of the same program so that we can hold constant as much as we can the features of the intervention and then compare across contexts, and others to go to modeling and to more to the macro literature to say, okay, let me strip down this intervention of the contextual elements and try to estimate a model that will allow me to extrapolate. And so this is, of course, a very appealing feature. It's not trivial to understand what you can strip down and what you can retain. The other source of dissatisfaction, I would say, is about scale-up, because at least in the original, in the early generation of trials, these were pilots and smaller scale experiments. Nowadays, people are running nationwide experiments with millions of individuals involved, but at least in the early stages, these pilots had the benefit of a very careful execution, sometimes by NGOs rather than governments. And there are things that change when you implement at scale that have to do with the motivation of the implementers, the incentives, the political backlash that might occur. So in this sense, having the possibility to study scaling with models that incorporate general equilibrium effects is clearly very important. And we know of some of these micro evidence that didn't hold when scaled precisely because of these general equilibrium effects, like what happens when you have migration and then the extent of this might induce changes in the community of origins labor markets and so on. So in this sense, I do agree with you that there has been a move away from the experiments per se. And I would say that there's even a third way, aside from generalizability and scaling, in which macro becomes appealing nowadays. Where by macro now, I mean the type of question that you ask and kind of big picture questions that require for example, putting in the same model the political structure, possibly social norms or other types of constraint, slow-moving variables in which through experiments, we can only go so far. Now, in this last respect, I don't know exactly that the tools that contemporary macro and models that are very quantitative in nature are exactly in the place where we are, where we want to be. So I would say I see this movement, I welcome it to the extent that it also allows us to generalize findings, scale interventions, and understand big picture questions. But I think both the macro and the micro need to work a little more to get where we want to be.
Thank you. That's fantastic and really interesting. I guess the theme of my first round of questions is really backward looking in all three cases. So, Rachel, I'm going to also look back and ask a question about the macro and growth literature. I think when you and I were in grad programs, and I'm not suggesting that we were in grad programs at the same time, to be clear.
Thank you.
But it was hard to find very many people in the macro and growth literature who were very interested in developing country contexts. Most of the growth literature was very focused on frontier growth in advanced countries. And that does seem like something that's been changing. And so I wonder if you'd just kind of talk a little bit about what you see as having taken place there and how that's, again, shaping where the literature is going.
Yeah, indeed. I think there was a big change since the time when I was studying economic growth under Bojan Jovanovic. That's where I learned my economic growth. So back then when you're studying, it was really a lot of paper and pencil. Okay, you have to derive the analytical result. So it's a lot of differential equation, and basically the thing that you can show very cleanly is the steady state result. So steady state result is the long run result. And when you think about long run growth, very naturally you apply to high income country. And to the extent, even when during that time, end of 90s, early 2000, when people trying to understand one of the biggest questions about development, which is why does some countries so much poorer than other country, a series of papers was written when they're trying to analyze the factors. They try to focus on the steady state. So implicitly, it's assuming both the rich country and the poor country are both on the steady state. Now that after 20 years, we know that sort of implicit assumption is quite wrong. The poor country is far from the steady state. So in fact, my job market paper was precisely on that. So that means I need to solve for the transitional dynamics. So I think the changes from back then to now is basically three things. There's the tools, the data, and the people who are doing it. So let me first talk about the diversity of researcher. So back then, most people who work in the field are from developed countries. So they have a specific mindset. I think with the last 20 years, the developing countries are growing. We have people from different countries coming into doing research. So myself coming from a developing country, when I look at that question, why does rich country much richer than the poor country? From a developing country point of view, I would say it's crazy to assume poor countries in steady state. So that is a different perspective because of the diversity of researcher. Another one is the tools. So back then, when I was solving the transitional dynamic, I have to use Fortran 77. So it was a very similar, I only have one capital, so one state variable. But just to do that, suiting algorithm, it took a few hours. And if I make a mistake in my code, it was a long time. So it wasn't as easy to solve for these transitional dynamics, which is the reason why so many people rely on papers and pencil. I think the last 20 years, the computing power has exploded. So we can now, really look at the actual transitional dynamic and look at country at different stage. In addition, we can also add in a lot of heterogeneity. We can look at distribution. So now, standard macro, even in many of your work, you talk about selection, you talk about heterogeneity, and then we can even address issues like inequality with quantity, okay? Not just theoretical results coming out of a picture. we actually can give number, which very often are useful for policy analysis. Another big changes in the tools very recently, last few years, is machine learning. So there's now a lot of text analysis. So back then, we always think of usefulness of patterns is based on citation data. Now people actually take the patterns abstract and trying to analyze what does this pattern really do? How new is this pattern? Is it just a vertical innovation with a marginal improvement over the past, or is actually a horizontal innovation? So, and also like people can now study about institution reform. Is it really always coming from above, or actually it's from bottom by analyzing historical texts to see how incidents are happening? There's also text analysis trying to understand social norm from looking at folk song, how songs has been changing to reflect changes and so on. So I think all these tools has resulted a much exciting and rich environment for us to learn about macro development together. And finally, is data. So, now with a lot of effort everywhere, documenting historical data, digitizing it, many libraries are putting up these digitized historical data, we can really learn from the, development path of many countries. And also, most importantly, personally, I think is we now also have more data on non-market variable, like the work you have done yourself, putting together the time use survey. So we don't just focus on GDP or consumption or expenditure, not those market variable. We know that, the non-market variable is substantial. Time that is allocated to home production is as high as market production. And those carry production value. If we look at the United States, so BEA showed that in 1947, home production value added is about 47% of GDP. It's very substantial, and it's changing over time, over the path of development, which means that, when you look across country, it's going to be very different. So this new availability of data has really broadened our perspective. So we don't have to necessarily focus on rich country and what happened to rich country in the steady state. So I think overall it's very, very useful development, and it's going to be very useful for policy. Linking to Eliana's point, it's not just about those very standard, macro policy, civilization policy. You can be very specific in terms of how policy should be designed. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Rachel. We won't ask any questions about who's still using Fortran 77. Some of us never really adapted beyond that. So, Paula, a similar kind of backward-looking question for you. Again, my recollection may be very fuzzy at this stage, but when I think back, let's just say 15 or 20 years or something, my sense is that the trade literature was not unnaturally entirely focused on international trade. It was about tariffs and changes in tariffs and maybe non-tariff barriers. And I feel that there's been a massive transformation in what the focus of the trade literature has been, and a lot more work focusing on within-country frictions in trade and spatial frictions. And is that a fair characterization, first of all? And if so, what you think has driven this move, and how does it relate to the broader questions here?
Thanks, Doug. So I think this is definitely a fair characterization.
I think you need to get close to the microphone.
I think, okay. So I was saying, I think this is definitely a fair characterization. In a nutshell, I think the reason for this shift is actually based partly on the enormous progress made by the empirical trade literature, showing very convincingly that trade induces large productivity gains. However, a second wave of literature found that those do not appear to be widely distributed, across the population. So I think this led, to this more recent literature trying to understand which are the frictions that prevent these gains from trade to reach a wider share of the population in developing countries. And that's, I guess, this shift. So let me explain a bit more in detail, this initial literature and then the more recent one. So this literature, probably 20 or 10 years ago, I think, there was a boom in empirical trade, and probably before than most macroeconomists, I think, trade economists started to take models very seriously and try to look at microdata patterns to understand theoretical mechanisms, in particular those linking trade and development or trade and growth. So there was a lot of work in studying or making available this detailed product and firm-level data that permitted direct observation of outcomes of interest at very different levels of aggregation, the product, the firm, industries, countries, etc. And then those outcomes were linked to exogenous changes in market size driven by trade liberalization episodes or other trade shocks. So I would say that this literature was very successful in making convincing or producing convincing evidence. And this led to a consensus view, I would say, that expansion into international markets induces firms to upgrade technology, quality, and skills, and leads to productivity gains. So I think most trade economists would agree with that. I guess a second question that emerged at that point was to what extent these mechanisms that were carefully documented at the firm level had welfare effects on workers in developing countries, in particular poor workers or workers in the informal sector. Answering this question is difficult. It's difficult to track firm-level productivity gains on outcomes of informal workers. The earliest attempts were made by Goldberg and Pavchnik, where they were basically exploiting variation across industries, and they found small effects on welfare, surprisingly, because there was this idea that trade was not benefiting the poor workers in developing countries, but it was very hard to identify using this variation in trade policy across sectors. And probably the first approach that was successful was the one by Topalova, where she decided to do a local labor market approach. And here the idea is that if you think of regions within a country as small open economies, in the sense that factors are in fixed supply, so there's no migration, no movement or a lot of movement of capital across regions, then you can apply the simple small open economy model to those regions. And then if you look at exogenous trade shocks across regions, you can identify under these strong assumptions of no factor mobility, the general equilibrium effects of trade policy on employment and wages. So this is what she did for India. And her main finding was that the trade liberalization in India, despite have a lot of research having shown that had very large positive effects on firm productivity, had negative effects on income for rural workers in particular. This, this led to further work. The most famous paper is authored Dorn and Hanson that applied this type of approach in the US, and again found negative effects of trade on industrial workers in particular. And then Dix Carniero and Kovac found similar effects in Brazil. All these papers, in an attempt to justify this local labor market approach, showed that these trade shocks had negative effects on wages and employment, but did not lead to migration. And this was, I think, a first surprising result, because there's no formal migration restrictions within countries, so you would expect that if a region due to import competition, face a negative labor demand shock, workers would move to other regions to find good opportunities. So I think these type of findings were the ones that raise awareness that internal frictions are important within countries, and that it was relevant to start taking them into account. So I think this is one of the reasons that led to interest in these economic geography models that focus on these frictions. This on the side of labor market frictions. At the same time, work by Dave Donaldson showed that there were important frictions across regions, trade frictions across regions in India, and that the expansion in infrastructure led to a reduction in those frictions, and that induced an increase in welfare. So there was this idea that internal trade frictions can have large effects on welfare. And again, also work by Dave and David Atkins showed substantial trade frictions within countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, like Ethiopia and Nigeria. So I think these findings led to a renewed interest in economic geography and trying to think how internal trade and migration costs can shape the impact of globalization in developing countries.
Thanks. That's a great history of thought in a real nutshell. So fantastic. Let me do a second round here that is probably following on the first. Again, back to you, Eliana. We're talking about macro development. I have a sense that not all that long ago, there was a micro development which didn't actually need to be described as micro. It was just the development economics community. And then there was some stuff called macro development. And there wasn't much conversation between these two strands of literature. I feel like that's disappearing before our eyes. At least that's my perception, that the conversations have opened up. The methods seem to be getting more similar in some ways. You mentioned people trying to use structural models with RCTs, and at the same time, there are people writing down macro models and calibrating them to data from RCTs. So is this one of these distinctions that's just going to evaporate, or do you still see it as a useful way to kind of structure different types of questions? Is it a useful concept or a useful distinction to keep in mind as we go forward? It's a little bit of an unfair question. This is in the spirit of future gazing. So
the short answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
Meaning, I can certainly see research being organized more around topics or questions now than on the micro-macro dichotomy. So if we think about all the work that STEG has done within CEPR, your work on structural transformation, it's clear that there's a very close link between the micro underpinning the macro implications, and so it wouldn't make sense to split that. It's one thing and it's answering one question. And I think similar arguments can be made for work on, for example, entrepreneurship and firm dynamics, where people are now really merging the micro and macro implications of the question, work on migration and labor markets, work on human capital. So these are all, I would think of characterizing researchers for their interest in a certain topic, and then many of the contemporary the kind of frontier approaches to these questions tend to bridge the micro and macro. The reason I said I don't know, and why I'm not exactly sure we can dismiss the distinction entirely, is that there are some traits that I think characterized micro-development, the way we learned it and implemented it, and that I don't know exactly how are embedded in this more holistic micro-macro framework. Let me tell you what I have in mind. One is really understanding the nuances of behavioral constraints to decision-making, where the same way as theorists might use the lab to really test different assumptions underlying one rationality hypothesis versus another hypothesis, the so-called micro-development researchers would really try to, in a fine-grained way, understand the dynamics of intra-household decision-making. And when you need to estimate complex models, and I think Rachel gave us a sense of how complicated things can get, many of these details need to be overlooked for a good reason. So I do still think that there is a place for an in-depth analysis where you might decide to have a more partial equilibrium approach or to narrow down your question, but dig deeper in certain respects. Another is the attention to implementation details, where I think in policy making, you cannot really overstate how much of the success sometimes hinges on the people in charge believing in the policy or in simple technical implementation details that, again, as economists, we often overlook. But when we do data collection or micro-level project implementation in the field, because in that case, even the research can be jeopardized by implementation failures, we tend to pay a bit more attention. So I guess what I'm asking is, my understanding of so-called micro-development economists is that implementation is taken seriously. And I don't know enough about the more micro-macro approach in terms of how implementation factors into the prediction and the prescriptions. And finally, when it comes to data, again, a certain generation of development economists has now become used to collecting their own data, which requires spending time in the field, getting to know the context. I think we are, still completely far from understanding the local context the way that someone from a region would. And so there's a lot to be improved in that respect. But again, I think on the macro side, there's quite a bit of heterogeneity, with some economists having as much local knowledge of the context and familiarity with data collection, and others being more users of existing sources. So I'm not sure how much of this is still valuable when we push things more to the macro implication. At the micro level, it's certainly valuable. So on these three issues of getting the nuances and the micro details of behavior and decision making, implementation, and collecting data and understanding the local context, I guess I would love to hear, for example, your view and your opinion on how much it's already integrated. And last, let me conclude that even though I think I'm comfortable thinking of this, question-driven approach, I think our training is still somewhat divided. So people who train in PhD programs sometimes get exposure to the micro side, get exposure to macro, and it's not obvious to me that we're helping them bridge and use both at the same time. So again, I think it would be interesting to maybe speculate a bit as to how in the future we might want to restructure our PhD training in the light of all the changes that we've seen on the tools, the models, and the questions.
Thanks. Fantastic. Really interesting and thought-provoking, too. I think you're still exactly right on knowledge of context. I think there are certainly people coming out of the macro literature who are deeply embedded in place and who've collected their own data, but it's far less standard than it is in the micro-development world. Rachel, flip a question to you on the macro growth literature where, again, thinking back, there used to be this goal of having sort of a common framework that would explain both growth within countries and differences in levels across countries, and maybe even sort of the unified growth theory, the effort to think about growth over much longer time spans. But the new literature that, as you've described it, seems to be focusing or thinking hard about frictions, about different institutions, about different policy choices in ways that seem to suggest that we need different models for different macroeconomies. And so are we moving away from the idea of a single macro framework, or is that still there in the background somehow?
So I will start with no. We can still have same model. I think that's the beauty of economics. When I choose to study economics, I appreciate the beauty, which is we're not doing case study. We don't do one situation with one model, another situation with another model. We try to put together economic mechanism and build a model trying to understand, under this set of assumption, what will happen. So from that perspective, I don't think, we should be moving to have different model for different economy or different period in time. But on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier on, you cannot force the same model with the same parameters to all the different economy. So, you could think of like a simple example, like, some of the recent debate on gender, discussion on gender, the role of home production, and how marketization of home production can help women's employment, because a lot of the home produce can be substitutable in the market sector. You can purchase the childcare service, cleaning service, etc. from the market. So with this one thing, you can think of that can be 4 different economic mechanisms in the same model, okay? So it could be the cost and the availability of the market service sector, okay, whether it's very costly to substitute. It could be whether the home technology is good enough. If it takes a long time to, if you don't even have water and electricity, it would take many hours for you to do the laundry, okay? It could be a labor regulation or laws. If you have a law that say men can stop a woman working if the man thinks the woman's job bring him shame. It could be also social norm. In some countries, they just don't want to see women working in the market, or they don't want to accept other people to come home to look after children or do the home production. So all these different factor could be different depending on the country. So the first one, the cost of this market sector could be most relevant for many developed countries. Say, we see some success in the Scandinavian country. Now Scandinavia has the most equal gender division of time. Female home production time is almost the same as men, whereas the world average is that women do 3 times more. In the case of UK, in March, we just introduced this new policy of 30 hours free childcare. And according to the Office of Budget Responsibility, that's the one policy that has the biggest potential impact on the output. But you cannot take the same thing to say, let's bring it to Africa, because if in Africa, they still have to go collect water from the river, collect wood from the forest, then this is not maybe their most concerning thing. Maybe in those countries, you have to think about the role of electrification or just building up these things. And then you can also not bring it to a country like Iran when they have a law such, men can just stop the woman if he thinks it's shameful for him. Or, in country that has very strong religion and social norm, that they just don't want to see women working. So I think, this is what we have to do if we want to have one model, yes, and we should benefit from the diversity of researchers, people coming from different country origin, or in Eliana's term, local people. They are the ones really will know what are the important. And we can also use a lot of the micro-estimates on some of these parameters. They could be of different values for different country, but we don't have to write a completely new model. So maybe in some countries, one of these factors is much more important than other. So I think this is one example, but it's a general principle. When you think about an issue, there are sure going to be many different factors, but we need to be flexible that this different factor might play different role in different country. Yeah, so my answer is yes and no. Yeah.
Suitably hedged, but no, I think really insightful. Paula, let me come to you again. And this is picking up on the spatial frictions, the focus of the literature on domestic spatial frictions, which you alluded to earlier. But with all of the focus of the literature there, are we in danger of losing the idea that international trade still matters somehow, that we still think there's something special about FDI, about exports, about openness? Is the literature, have we lost that? And if so, what do we need to do to bring it back?
I think international trade does matter a lot. So that I don't think we have lost. I think, if you look at most successful development episodes, in the last few decades have been associated with export booms or expansions in export markets, most notably in East Asia. So I think this, for many trade economists, this lends support to this idea that, this transition, that is part of the development process from agriculture to manufacturing, requires the adoption of some advanced technologies which are subject to increasing returns, and then they are only profitable when they are operated on a large enough market or a large enough scale. And here there's two theoretical mechanisms that have been proposed to attain this scale. One is this expansion in international markets. Hellman-Krugman is kind of the classic textbook reference there. And a second is growth in domestic markets. Here, usually models have some initial push in income, like agricultural productivity growth that generates demand for manufacturers and services, like in the classic paper by Murphy, Schleifer, and Vishny. So there are some clear success stories of the first mechanism, this export-led growth. It's harder to find evidence on the second. There is a recent paper by Goldberg and Reed that looks systematically at the evidence in the last few years, and what they basically find is that all the episodes of what they call sustained poverty reduction, which is reductions in poverty that last in time, have been preceded by fast export growth and not by fast productivity growth in agriculture. So this lends support to this idea that at least in the past, the international market has been very important. There is some evidence for India that in that case, there's this paper by Michael Peters and Fabrizio Silibotti showing that productivity growth in the service sector has led to some growth. However, when they look at the distributional implications of that growth, they find that it favored mostly urban, higher income workers. So in my view, the question is not whether integration into these world markets is the road to development. It's, for most developing countries, it's necessary. I guess the open question is more whether these gains can be widely distributed in developing countries. And here is where the new literature on spatial frictions and internal frictions in both labor and goods markets is useful to understand to what extent these frictions are impeding these gains. So one simple example that I think is relevant for development is what happens with countries that have a comparative advantage in agriculture. So in these cases, you know, that the evidence shows that this doesn't seem to lead to a poverty reduction. There's many different mechanisms that one can think of what is the concern. One is that if a country has a comparative advantage in agriculture, that's going to lead to specialization in agriculture and not in manufacturing. Agricultural technologies are more and more labor saving, so this implies that income gains can be concentrated in the hands of landowners. So those type of growth experiences, you know, tend to not lead to widespread gains. That's one of the concerns. A second concern is that labor market frictions might constrain this relocation process from agriculture to manufacturing in some of these countries. And a final concern is that goods market frictions, in the sense of there being long intermediation chains, can imply that some of the gains from agricultural exports do not reach farmers because there's large markups and a lot of intermediaries. So these are different ways in which these frictions, you know, can make it hard for these gains to be widely distributed. So I think, you know, the current work on exploring which of these frictions are important is very useful. You can think of different ways in which you could solve these problems, and I guess identifying which of these 4 problems is more important leads to different policies. If you think the problem is that gains go to landowners, then you can think of redistribution policies, you know, away from landowners to try to sustain a middle class. Here, some Latin American countries have been successful, like Brazil, for example, at doing that. Others, most notably Venezuela or Argentina, have been unsuccessful. So one, I think, interesting area for work is to think about when are these, you know, when are these policies successful, and what are the state capacities needed to think about those policies. Other area of research that is quite active is thinking about supply-side policies that can help the development of the industrial sector, even in countries that have a comparative advantage in agriculture. So there's a new wave of research on industrial policy, trying to think when and where it has been successful. The idea here is that the industrial sector generates, you know, more labor demand than agriculture, higher quality jobs, and that might also be a path for development. Another strand of literature thinks about competition policy. So Meredith Starts, for example, has a research agenda thinking about policy interventions to reduce intermediation costs in sub-Saharan Africa. And finally, labor market integration policy. So I think so far the literature has put emphasis on infrastructure investment and how infrastructure can integrate internal labor markets, finding in general positive effects. But there's other policies that could be thought of and evaluated. So I think this is an interesting area where we still don't have a consensus on which are the frictions and which are the right policies.
Thanks, Paula. We have, to invoke an American political term, we've managed to filibuster very effectively. I think we still have about 5 minutes for questions. So I wonder if we can, if there's a couple of questions, maybe we can collect a couple. And I don't want to get in the way of coffee. So I see one up here, another in the middle there. So let's just collect 2 or 3 And please introduce yourselves as you ask. Johannes.
Hi, Johannes Böhm from Sciences Po. So I wanted to ask you about your view on this literature on misallocation. So in some ways, I've originally been thinking about this, literature about misallocation across firms as maybe one of the potentially most potent explanations for these very large productivity differences that we see across countries. But at the same time, much of that literature in the end is just backing out some kind of distortions where we don't really know where they're coming from. And in the end, it kind of leaves us with very little that we can directly point to particular policies and say, okay, you can remove some of those distortions by improving policies. So what's your view about how we can connect kind of these distortions back with things that are policy, like that closely connect to policy, or maybe other alternative ways of getting at these large productivity differences that we see in the data? Thanks.
Thanks. So Clément had a question? Others?
Simple question, what about climate change and the environment?
Anything else? I sense one in the front and then another one halfway back. So David and then Bruno.
Yes. Oh. So I'm David Delacroix. So a question about teaching. It was briefly mentioned, but I have the feeling that there is the gap between what is actually taught in PhD programs and research is increasing. So how would you design an advanced class in macro growth development?
Who's going to answer these, by the way? And Bruno, and then I think we should...
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bruno Conte, Università Pompeu Fabra. I have a question on eventually these limits between this micro to macro integration. I wonder about your opinion on sort of outcomes that in developing literature have been studied extensively, such as, I don't know, child malnutrition, educational attainment, many of these things, whereas on the macro side, people have been studying a lot structural change, misallocation, productivity growth. Is eventually this, the outcome variable, a barrier in between us, or you see a potential also of integration? Thanks.
We have some tough decisions to make here about who's going to... I'm willing, Paula, why don't we let each of you have a minute to respond to whichever ones you want, and
Maybe
I'll try to clean up at the end.
say something about the misallocation.
Fine.
One, yeah.
Okay.
So now I agree with you. There was a lot that is backing out with the residual. There's this wedge, and this wedge matched this target. And now let me close this wedge and see how much it improved. So I think there are more effort trying to see exactly what these wedges are. Now I have to claim my own example. So for example, I work on China, looking at the misallocation of China across agriculture and non-agriculture. And that's what I was telling about the diversity of researchers, because I'm coming from China. So I know there was one very important wedge, which is the hukou system. And then once, researchers who have that specific institution knowledge, then they will have to work hard to write down a model that expresses it. And then I can actually match those systems to the data, and then give me a direct measurement of the wedge. And then we can make proposal and say, if the government relax this policy, then, even in the presence of other wedges, which are residual, but if you relax this directly measurable one, I could get this much. So of course I couldn't say, at a very micro level, across, firm. So here I'm really talking about sector, because hukou is restricting the people. If they leave the agriculture land, they risk the land being reallocated. So the land income is added to their labor income when they do this labor mobility. When they go to the city, they lose out, they pay the tax, they don't get any benefit. So therefore, that's like a heavily wage cut on them. So these are directly measurable, because I can look at the land share, I can look at the government spending on these services. Now this is just one example, but I think if you think hard enough, there is appreciation from the literature that if you actually measure this wedge directly, rather than impute it as a wedge.
I wanted to answer the climate question, and I can also answer the teaching question. I can see what I do in my class. But about the climate, I think, here, the way I like to think about climate change in the context of developing countries is a very large negative shock to agricultural productivity. And that, if you use these geography and trade models to think about this shock, this is going to generate a reallocation in the model. Optimally should generate a reallocation away from agriculture into manufacturing or services, and away from the regions that get negative agricultural productivity shock towards other regions. So in a sense, that's the optimal adjustment, but all this literature documenting all these frictions for reallocation of labor, both across sectors and across space, make us worried that this adjustment might not be as simple as predicted by the theory. So I think it is super important that we start looking at the data on the climate shocks that have already happened and understanding which are the main frictions in this reallocation process to prepare for helping workers in these countries reallocate when these shocks start being even larger than they already are.
So maybe I want to add a little bit just on the climate thing, because I see this as one of those topics where maybe the micro and macro have not yet exactly merged, in the sense that those who study adaptation from a micro perspective are trying to understand the technology adoption side, the belief formation of farmers, and the role of uncertainty as it translates into individual decisions, while the macro models of climate change and impact of the economy seem to be starting from different premises. But I was quite struck by something that Mar told me yesterday, and she's in the audience, so maybe she should pick up the mic. And she said that really all of economics and not environmental economics should now, maybe I'm not saying it the right way, you correct me, but what struck me was she said, well, maybe we should just think about these projections being so much out of sample about what's going to happen to us, that every field within economics should have a subfield called emergency economics. So how do you deal with something that could go completely wrong and out of what we can imagine? And so we can think of whatever macro development as not really being prepared in terms of making these out-of-sample predictions, and that goes beyond understanding, environmental economics. So it was thought-provoking for me yesterday. I have no clue how to move, but Mar will know what emergency economics might look like. So you can go to her, but I think we have someone else who should conclude the panel here.
I think I probably should conclude the panel, because I think we're out of time and in danger of getting away from coffee break. I do want to say to David's question that I think that the challenge of rethinking curriculum and rethinking how we teach development economics, partly development economics as development economics, but partly also how we teach other fields of economics, so that we're including examples and cases from developing countries and no longer hiving them off as being an entirely distinct area. I think that's already happening. I think increasingly, if you study I/O, you'll be reading examples with data that come from low and middle income countries. And if you're doing labor economics or any kind of applied microfield, you're reading literature from low and middle income contexts. So I think the challenge is there for all of us, and I think how we teach development and how we teach climate and environmental economics as well, I think these are things where integrating these important subject areas into how we teach economics and how we explain it to the broader public. I think these are things that are important for us all to take on. And maybe at that, having done violence to Bruno's question, I realize, which we can talk about separately, but I think we ought to close out, and I just want to thank the panelists for a really interesting session. So thank you all. They also got their arms twisted to do this, so a special thank you to all three of them.